He sits alone in the dim light of his apartment, the hum of the city outside, a distant reminder of the world continuing without his knowledge. The glass in his hand trembles not from the alcohol, not from fatigue, but from the slow, insidious realization that something has changed. He had sensed it before, a subtle shift in her tone, a new kind of distance in her gaze, the imperceptible hesitation in her touch. Tonight, it crystallizes. She laughs at a joke that wasn't funny. She speaks in half-truths and omissions. He reaches for the words that might salvage the moment, to bridge the invisible gulf that yawns between them. They fall flat, they crumble. His attempt at connection meets only emptiness. The crushing weight of awareness presses down. Her heart has migrated without announcement. Her allegiance has quietly retreated, and in that retreat, she has enacted a silent coup, one that strips him of authority, of presence, of the power he assumed was his by virtue of shared intimacy. This is the revelation Machiavelli whispered across centuries, if one listens not to the surface of politics, but to the micropolitics of human relationships. Power is never static. Influence is never given. It is seized, maintained, and defended. And when a man neglects the subtleties of relational dominion, when he allows complacency to seep into his life, the transfer is imperceptible until it has become inevitable. This is not a tale of blame, but of awakening. This is the thesis. A man's perception of love, fidelity, and influence is a battlefield, and indifference is surrender. A silent coup is not heralded by explosions, but by whispers, smiles, and calculated omissions. Machiavelli's insight is simple yet profound. Power is the currency of human interaction. And like currency, it devalues when ignored. It fluctuates when taken for granted. It is counterfeit when feigned. The question then becomes, how does a man detect when his influence has been undermined? How does he recognize the subtle acts of betrayal that threaten his dominion over the emotional and social contract he believed immutable? It begins with acute observation, an unflinching gaze at reality, unsanitized by hope or denial. The first indicator is not grand. It is microscopic a change in posture, in frequency of attention, in the emotional economy of conversation. These small deviations are the vanguard of a power shift, and if left unchecked, they become the infrastructure of displacement. Consider the man who confronts her directly, demanding confession or explanation. He speaks with anger, with hurt, with moral entitlement. The response is predictable: deflection, minimization, justification. His approach assumes that rational argument, moral clarity, and emotional sincerity are sufficient weapons. They are not. In these interactions, Machiavelli's lesson applies: one cannot reason with entropy. Influence is not preserved through entitlement or virtue. It is maintained through presence, through strategic engagement, and through the cultivation of an aura that asserts unspoken authority. To confront without power is to validate the shift already underway. A man must first recalibrate his perception of himself within the hierarchy of his relationship. This is no exercise in ego, but in strategic awareness. He must ask, without flinching, the questions he has long avoided. What is my value in her eyes, absent assumption? Where does her allegiance truly lie? What forces, desire, fear, habit, calculation shape her attention and her commitment? Every answer to these questions is a datum point, a signal in the network of relational power. And he must listen not only to words, but to silences, not only to actions, but to inactions, and to the spaces in between where truth reveals itself in stark, unsentimental clarity. Once he acknowledges the displacement, the next step is mastery of response. The common reaction is to plead, to bargain, to attempt reconciliation on terms dictated by her newfound latitude. This is collapse. It reinforces her autonomy and cements the perception that his presence is negotiable. The power response is precise, deliberate, and unyielding. It is the assertion of value through action, not argument. It is presence that commands attention by intensity, by consistency, by the cultivation of an inner life that is invulnerable to her shifting tides. It is recognition that withdrawal of energy, when strategically applied, signals dominance more effectively than confrontation ever could. Pause here. Consider the gravity. If influence can be seized in silence, it can also be regained in silence. The battlefield of fidelity is navigated not through noise, but through disciplined perception, strategic withdrawal, and calibrated engagement. Here lies the first revelation. The coup is a symptom, not a cause. Its detection is not punishment, but insight. And the question emerges, sharper and more dangerous. How does a man reconstruct his authority in the aftermath of a silent rebellion? The answer begins with the inner alignment of identity. To detect her subtle usurpation is only the first victory. The second is mastery over self-perception, over emotional reactivity, over the habitual concessions that erode sovereignty. A man must cultivate a psychological infrastructure that makes him resilient to manipulation and impervious to distraction. He does so not through brute force or overt control, but through presence, consistency, and an unwavering commitment to self-definition. In this state, he is no longer vulnerable to the silent coup, because the essence of authority resides not in her compliance, but in the integrity of his own being. Her infidelity, real or symbolic, becomes a mirror. It reflects not just her choices, but the latent weaknesses he tolerated in himself. Every omission she performs is a challenge to his structural capacity to command respect, attention, and desire. And every micro-victory she achieves in this rebellion is a lesson. Power is relational, dynamic, and continuously negotiated. To accept this truth is to awaken. To deny it is to remain shackled in illusion. Human mind craves narrative coherence. A man will often seek to rationalize her distance, to explain it away as temporary, circumstantial, or external. Machiavelli warns against this comforting fiction. Influence does not linger for convenience. It is maintained only through active engagement with the mechanisms of loyalty, attraction, and presence. The moment one assumes permanence, the structure begins to crumble. Every whispered joke that elicits her smile, every deliberate absence that sparks reflection, every act of disciplined attention or withdrawal is a chess move in the silent war of relational power. He must learn to interpret the signals. Is she withholding intimacy? Is she deflecting questions? Does she engage more readily with external validation and with his presence? Each of these is not merely a behavioral anomaly, but a strategic pivot in the distribution of influence. And the response must be measured, not emotional, not reactive. Strategic reassertion of presence, cultivated competence, and unflinching self-possession are the counterforces. Authority is not demanded, it is radiated. It is not begged for, it is earned in the subtle negotiation of every interaction, every glance, every choice. A man who internalizes this understanding transforms not through retaliation, but through elevation. He becomes the gravity around which relational dynamics orbit. Her shift in allegiance ceases to diminish him because he no longer defines his power through external validation. His presence is consequential by default, not by permission. And when she tests boundaries, it is she who must navigate the terrain he defines, not the other way around. The silent coup exposes the battlefield of desire, loyalty, and dominance. It asks whether he will remain passive, a victim to the imperceptible erosion of influence, or whether he will assert his sovereignty through disciplined presence, calculated withdrawal, and unyielding self-mastery. Every conversation, every gesture, every choice becomes a tool in the reclamation of authority. To fail in this understanding is to invite perpetual subversion. To succeed is to embody a form of masculine power that is neither aggressive nor submissive, but unassailable in its quiet command. This is the moment of truth. Power is never static, and influence never guaranteed. A man's capacity to detect, interpret, and respond to subtle shifts in loyalty defines not just his relational standing, but the integrity of his identity. Machiavelli's counsel is clear: vigilance, strategic awareness, and the disciplined cultivation of self-defined authority are the weapons with which a man safeguards his dominion. The silent coup is not merely a threat, it is a signal, a test, and a crucible for transformation. The man who rises to this challenge embraces his sovereignty. He studies the micropolitics of intimacy, he recognizes the patterns of shifting allegiance, and he calibrates his actions with precision. He does not plead, he does not bargain. He asserts presence, he radiates competence, he commands without demand. And in this embodiment, he becomes impervious to subtle betrayals, unshakable in the face of withdrawal, and magnetic in a manner that no silent coup can ever diminish. She has moved, yes, but he has moved first into mastery of himself, mastery of perception, mastery of influence. And in this ascension, the relational landscape is transformed. He stands not in retaliation, but in inevitability, the architect of his own authority, the sentinel of his presence, the sovereign of his domain. Her infidelity, her quiet withdrawal, the coup that once threatened to unravel his existence, now serves as the crucible in which he forges unassailable power. And the final choice presents itself not as a question of her fidelity, but of his identity. Will he remain a man defined by external approval, or will he ascend to the quiet dominion of self-mastery, where influence is radiated, loyalty is earned, and authority is absolute? This is the path. The detection of the coup is the spark. The mastery of self is the fire. The reclamation of sovereignty is the inevitable consequence. In the shadows of betrayal, a man discovers not weakness, but the blueprint for unyielding power. To internalize this is to step into a new paradigm of masculinity. The man who remains passive, who allows emotional turbulence to dictate his behavior, becomes a reactive entity, a satellite orbiting her choices rather than the sun of his own agency. He confuses love with submission, presence with permission, and attention with ownership. The silent coup, in this lens, is less about her actions than it is about his failure to enforce boundaries, to assert identity, and to cultivate the gravitational pull of his own presence. Every microshift she executes is mirrored by the gaps he leaves in his attention, the compromises he allows in his demeanor, and the erosion of his personal sovereignty. He must adopt a radical awareness of the dynamics at play. Notice the change in cadence when she speaks. Observe the subtle avoidance of eye contact. Pay attention to the topics she initiates and the spaces she avoids. These are not coincidences. They are signals. The silent coup manifests through behavioral economics, the allocation of attention, desire, and commitment shifting subtly, often imperceptibly, until the balance of power has moved. And yet, within this shift lies opportunity, the power to recalibrate, to redefine the relational topography, to assert influence not through confrontation, but through disciplined presence and psychological gravitas. The common mistake is overreaction. Anger, pleading, or frantic attempts to reclaim attention only validate the shift, signaling insecurity and vulnerability. This is the collapse point Machiavelli would warn against: reaction without strategic assessment. The power response is measured, deliberate, and grounded in self-mastery. The man must cultivate an internal ecosystem of competence, purpose, and presence that is not contingent upon external validation. By doing so, he becomes a force field around which relational dynamics orient, regardless of her attempts to withdraw or manipulate. Authority, in this context, is radiated, not demanded. Consider the psychological reality. Humans are pattern-seeking organisms. She responds not to your words, but to your consistency and presence. The silent coup exposes the fragility of relationships, where attention and influence are assumed rather than actively maintained. When she perceives inconsistency, weakness, or distraction, she reallocates her investment. When he maintains composure, enforces boundaries, and radiates purpose. He becomes the stabilizing force in the relational environment. Influence is thus regained not through confrontation, but through disciplined alignment of actions with self-defined values. This alignment requires ruthless self-honesty. Every compromise he has tolerated, every boundary he has neglected, and every moment of emotional dependence must be catalogued. Awareness is the first tool of reclamation. He asks himself, which behaviors have seeded influence? Where has my presence been diluted? How have I allowed complacency to define interaction? The answers are uncomfortable, but necessary. They illuminate the points of vulnerability, the levers of influence, and the pathways to reclamation. From this self-assessment, a strategy emerges. It is not reactive. It is anticipatory. It prioritizes presence, purpose, and the cultivation of a personal ecosystem that is magnetic and unyielding. Strategic withdrawal from emotionally draining interactions, measured attention, and unflinching commitment to self-defined goals are the tactics by which a man reasserts authority. Each interaction becomes a test. He observes, adjusts, and responds with precision. Influence is thus reclaimed incrementally, imperceptibly, until her subtle withdrawals are countered by an unassailable gravitational presence. Consider the relational battlefield as a game of chess. Every move she makes, the delayed text, the withheld smile, the nuanced avoidance, is a calculated pivot. Every action he takes maintaining composure, exercising discretion, projecting unwavering self-confidence, is a countermove. To react emotionally is to sacrifice the strategic advantage. To act with disciplined awareness is to reclaim the board. Mastery is not in winning overt confrontations, but in structuring the relational environment so that influence flows naturally toward him. Observe the interplay between desire and attention. She will naturally gravitate toward energy that is steady, competent, and magnetic. He cultivates this through self-investment, expansion of purpose, and elimination of dependency. The silent coup is neutralized, not by coercion, but by inevitability. The relational landscape bends toward the center of gravity he has established. It is subtle, it is profound, and it is irreversible once internal mastery is achieved. The crucial psychological insight is this: control is internal before it is external. No amount of outward force can substitute for inner sovereignty. Every attempt to compel loyalty without internal authority will falter. Conversely, internal mastery projects influence effortlessly, reshaping relational dynamics without visible struggle. She may resist, she may withdraw, but she cannot alter the gravitational pull of a man fully aligned with himself. This is the essence of transformation. The silent coup, rather than a catastrophe, is the crucible through which masculine authority is forged. Detection is the spark. Strategic recalibration is the forge. Mastery of self is the tempering fire. Every subtle betrayal becomes a lesson. Every perceived slight an opportunity for refinement. Every shift in her behavior a prompt for disciplined, intentional response. He emerges not as a man reacting to circumstance, but as a sovereign architect of relational dynamics. The power he wields is subtle, magnetic, and resilient. Influence flows naturally toward him, not because of coercion or manipulation, but because he embodies principles that cannot be ignored: presence, competence, purpose, and unwavering self-mastery. At this juncture, the choice is unambiguous. He may cling to the illusion of external validation, perpetually at the mercy of subtle coups, or he may embrace the sovereignty within. The silent coup ceases to be a threat because he has internalized authority, calibrated response, and cultivated an irresistible presence. Fidelity, attention, and loyalty then become reflections of the gravitational pull he exerts, not arbitrary concessions extracted from her. This is the paradigm shift. Detection leads to insight, insight to strategy, strategy to internal mastery, and mastery to inevitable authority. In the shadows of infidelity, the man discovers not loss, but opportunity. He stands not diminished, but elevated, not reactive, but sovereign. Influence is reclaimed, not through force, but through presence. Loyalty is earned, not demanded. Power is not taken, it is radiated, immutable, and magnetic. The final edict is absolute. A man's sovereignty begins within. His ability to detect subtle shifts, interpret hidden dynamics, and respond with disciplined presence defines not only relational outcomes, but the architecture of his identity. The silent coup is neither his undoing nor her victory. It is the catalyst for transformation. He can remain passive, or he can rise to mastery. He can remain defined by external tides, or he can embody the unshakable gravity of self-sovereignty. The choice is his, the consequence inevitable, and the power within fully attainable. He moves through the world, now as a different man. Each interaction becomes an opportunity to reinforce presence, to assert authority through subtlety, to communicate value without uttering a word. The lessons of the silent coup are etched into every gesture, every posture, every pause. He does not need to control her. He needs only to command himself. In doing so, the relational landscape aligns, unconsciously, inevitably, around the axis of his presence. Her withdrawals, her tests, her moments of distance, all are neutralized by the constancy of his self-possession. Observe the mechanics of influence. It is neither coercive nor reactive. It is magnetic. It emanates from clarity of purpose, emotional stability, and the disciplined cultivation of personal sovereignty. A man who has internalized this principle no longer interprets her actions as challenges to his value. He interprets them as data, indicators of relational dynamics, and opportunities to adjust his strategy. The silent coup ceases to be a crisis. It becomes the mirror through which he hones presence, sharpens perception, and solidifies authority. Every lapse in attention, every tolerated compromise, had previously invited her subtle withdrawal. Now he perceives these microsignals instantly, responds with measured adjustments, and reinforces boundaries without drama. He has learned that influence is preserved through consistency, and that emotional volatility is the vector through which power is lost. The coup, once threatening, is rendered inert because he has shifted the battlefield inward. His power is not contingent upon her behavior. It is inherent, radiated, and immutable. Consider desire as a form of energy that responds to gravitational pull. She is drawn to stability, competence, and unshakable presence. When he maintains composure in the face of ambiguity, invests in self-expansion, and refuses to react to minor provocations, he generates an invisible force field of influence. It is subtle, yet absolute. She may test, probe, or withdraw, but the underlying dynamics now favor him. Influence has been reclaimed, not through coercion, not through pleading, but through mastery of self and strategic alignment of presence with principle. He understands now that the silent coup is a reflection of what he tolerates internally. Every micro-betrayal she enacts corresponds to a neglected boundary, a conceded principle, or a moment of distraction in his own life. The remedy is not confrontation, but recalibration. Each action he takes reinforces his sovereignty, disciplined attention to self, relentless pursuit of purpose, cultivation of competence, and projection of calm authority. By doing so, he transforms the battlefield into a landscape of inevitable gravitational dominance. Here lies the psychological crucible. A man must withstand the discomfort of recognition. The coup exposes not just her shifts, but the subtle ways in which he allowed erosion. Acceptance is not defeat, it is insight. Awareness is the precursor to action. The next step is strategic execution, subtle withdrawal from distractions, measured engagement in interactions, and cultivation of a life so compelling that attention flows naturally toward him. Influence is not demanded, it is magnetically drawn. Notice the subtle patterns in her behavior, the topics she avoids, the jokes she laughs at without genuine mirroring, The micro-delays in communication each is a vector of power realignment. By perceiving these with clarity and responding with disciplined presence, he reverses the trajectory of influence. The silent coup, once a threat, becomes the catalyst for self-mastery and relational realignment. Authority flows not from her compliance, but from the consistency, competence, and unassailable presence he projects. This mastery is relational alchemy, transforming subtle betrayals into instruments of growth, recalibrating attention to reclaim authority, and converting potential vulnerability into uncheckable sovereignty. He no longer measures worth by her validation. He measures it by the integrity of his own presence, the alignment of his actions with his principles, and the magnetic pull generated by unwavering self-mastery. Every subtle test she imposes becomes irrelevant. Every microshift in her allegiance neutralized by the constancy of his gravitational authority. The paradigm is unassailable. External shifts cannot destabilize the man who commands internal authority. He does not flinch at withdrawal, does not react to subtle coups, and does not chase validation. His influence radiates naturally from the architecture of self-mastery he has constructed. The silent coup is no longer a threat, it is the mechanism through which he forges and confirms unassailable presence. At this stage, mastery extends beyond detection to anticipation. He now perceives relational dynamics before they manifest, adjusting presence, energy, and engagement proactively. This anticipatory command transforms subtle infidelity or withdrawal into a series of navigable vectors rather than crisis. Influence becomes fluid yet anchored, dynamic yet inevitable. Authority is maintained not by effort, but by design. Presence radiates, loyalty orbits naturally, and tests lose potency. In the culmination of this transformation, he embodies sovereignty not as domination, but as inevitability. Influence is no longer conditional. Loyalty is no longer coerced, and relational dynamics are aligned to the gravitational field of his own being. The silent coup, once feared, is now absorbed into the architecture of mastery. Each subtle threat becomes an affirmation of his authority, each micro-challenge a confirmation of his presence. The final edict resounds. True power is internal, relational influence is derivative, and sovereignty begins with mastery of self. Detection is the spark. Insight is the fire. Strategic recalibration is the forge. Mastery is the tempered steel from which unassailable authority emerges. She may test, she may withdraw, but he stands unshaken, magnetic, and sovereign. The choice is absolute. Remain subject to external tides or ascend to self-defined dominion, where influence is radiated, loyalty flows naturally, and power is absolute. He now understands that every subtle withdrawal, every fleeting distraction on her part, is not simply an act of defiance. It is a mirror reflecting the depth of his own presence. Where once he might have sought validation through her attention, now he measures himself against the constancy of his purpose, the discipline of his routines, the clarity of his identity. Influence, he realizes, is never a gift. It is a manifestation of internal authority projected outward, a gravitational force that bends relational dynamics to the axis of his being. The silent coup, once feared, now illuminates the precise coordinates where mastery must be asserted and reinforced. Her micro-shifts subtle delays in communication, minor changes in tone, the avoidance of certain topics once threatened destabilization. Now they are data points, instructive signals that reveal patterns in desire, attention, and allocation of emotional energy. He tracks these without judgment, without emotional turbulence, and without haste. Each observation informs calibrated action, measured withdrawal, intensified self-investment, and consistent projection of competence. He understands that authority is not enforced by confrontation, but radiated through presence. That dominance is maintained not by coercion, but by predictability, magnetism, and psychological gravity. Consider the relational battlefield, a landscape of hidden vectors and silent negotiations. Every interaction, every glance, every lapse in attention or focus is a chess move. The silent coup manifests in whispers, smiles, and omissions, testing the boundaries of influence, probing weaknesses, and measuring reaction. In the past, he might have responded impulsively, attempting to reclaim what he assumed was his by right. Now he knows that reaction without strategy reinforces her latitude and solidifies the shift. The power response is patience, awareness, and deliberate action. Presence is the weapon. Composure is the armor. Consistency is the sword. This is not passive acceptance. It is active sovereignty. He engages in the world with precision, allocating attention as a resource rather than a gift, investing energy in self-expansion rather than validation-seeking, and cultivating a psychological ecosystem that is impervious to manipulation. He has internalized the lesson that the silent coup is not an endpoint, but a catalyst, a prompt to elevate, refine, and assert authority with calculated inevitability. She may attempt to test, distract, or withdraw, but the gravitational field of his presence bends the relational landscape toward him, regardless of her maneuvers. The psychological principle at play is simple but profound. Influence is relational energy, not entitlement. It is derived from presence, competence, and alignment with purpose. Every micro-betrayal she enacts is countered not with argument, but with internal fortitude and strategic presence. A man who embodies this principle projects authority unconsciously. He is magnetic not because he demands attention, but because he radiates it from an unshakable center. Loyalty, desire, and attention become natural consequences of his internal architecture, no longer contingent upon negotiation or persuasion. The transformation is total. Where once he may have defined himself by her validation, he now defines himself by his own actions, principles, and presence. The silent coup is reframed. It is not a signal of weakness or loss, but a test of mastery, a crucible through which authority is forged and confirmed. Each subtle withdrawal, each act of omission, each minor infidelity becomes a prompt for recalibration, refinement, and self-sovereignty. He is no longer reactive. He is anticipatory. He does not chase influence. He radiates it. He does not plead for attention. He commands it through the inevitability of his presence. Now, consider the interplay of desire and attention. She is drawn to energy that is stable, competent, and compelling. By cultivating this energy through purpose, discipline, and self-alignment, he creates a relational environment in which her loyalty and engagement are secondary consequences, not prerequisites. He navigates the terrain of subtle rebellion with calm authority, transforming potential crises into opportunities for reinforcement of dominance. The silent coup becomes a teacher rather than a threat. The battlefield of relational dynamics is now under his command, mapped and understood with precision. The apex of this transformation is inevitability. Every calculated presence, every disciplined choice, every act of self-mastery accumulates to form a gravitational center around which relational influence orbits naturally. Her subtle infidelity, her quiet withdrawals, her tests of boundaries, all become irrelevant against the magnitude of his internal sovereignty. He embodies a form of authority that cannot be undermined, challenged, or displaced. Power is radiated, not demanded. Influence is drawn, not coerced. Loyalty is earned, not extracted. This is the final crucible. A man's sovereignty begins within. Detection, insight, strategy, and self-mastery form a continuum that transforms threat into opportunity, displacement into gravitational dominance, and subtle betrayal into a forge for unassailable presence. The silent coup is no longer a source of fear. It is a catalyst for transformation, a signal for refinement, and a mirror reflecting the power he has cultivated within. The ultimate choice is stark and unyielding. Continue to define masculinity through external validation, forever at the mercy of subtle coups, or embrace self-sovereignty, radiate influence through presence, and command relational dynamics with strategic inevitability. The silent coup will test, probe, and withdraw, but he stands immutable, magnetic, and sovereign. The relational landscape bends toward him, not by force, but by the law of internal authority made manifest. In the end, the man who rises to this understanding achieves mastery beyond mere relational control. He becomes the architect of influence, the sentinel of presence, and the embodiment of unshakable power. The silent coup, once threatening, is absorbed into the architecture of his sovereignty. Authority radiates from his being. Loyalty orbits naturally. Influence flows without effort. And in this state, he is no longer defined by the actions of others, but by the gravitational force of his own self-mastery. This is the doctrine of masculine transformation. Detection ignites awareness. Awareness informs strategy. Strategy cultivates self-mastery, and self-mastery generates magnetic, unassailable authority. The silent coup is the spark that reveals weakness, the test that refines presence, and the crucible that confirms dominance. He stands immutable, sovereign, and inevitable, a man whose authority is not granted, but radiated, whose influence is not begged, but magnetically drawn, and whose power is absolute.